So let's go ahead and start then. I think it's good enough now at this point. Well, I'll pull up the refuge prayer. We're going to do the refuge and bodhicitta prayer 3 times as we usually do. And the first time we'll do it in English, kind of bringing to mind these words that are about finding safe direction in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, really renewing that sense that we have some confidence in the Buddha's teachings in particular. And then the second, last 2 lines, the generation of the motivation of bodhicitta, we'll also meditate on this a little bit before we start. But this is the wish to become a Buddha so we can bring all sentient beings to that same state of Buddhahood. So let's recite it the first time in English, and then we'll do it twice more, chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chanyan gi pesanam gi, dola penchu sangye duparsho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chanyan gi pesanam gi, dola penchir sangye duparsho. So as I said, we'll do a short meditation in order to strengthen our motivation, a bodhicitta, for being here. So do a few minutes of meditation on the breath to focus your mind. No doubt we've all had busy days with lots of things going on, perhaps some things still bouncing around in our minds. So when we meditate on the breath, we try to keep our awareness with the breath and allow some of that to kind of fall away, not get caught up and follow all these thoughts, but rather let our thoughts diminish to some extent. So again, you can work with the breath in whatever way you prefer. Have a suggestion if you need one, which is to work with the point around the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and out. I find in the evening that's a particularly good point to work with because it's higher up in the body, so you're not focusing on the lower abdomen or what have you. So you can bring your awareness up a little bit. But again, choose whatever technique you prefer to work with the breath and use that for the next few minutes. So we'll do this in silence, and then I will lead you in setting our motivation for tonight. So before we set our motivation, let's just do a short exploration of this idea of living fully. And maybe we can think back throughout our lives. How have we defined that? How have we looked at our lives in the context of trying to live life fully, completely? Maybe when we were younger, we had some ideas about kind of going for the gusto or a sort of carpe diem, seizing the day, trying to make the most out of what life has to offer. And perhaps that view is still there to some degree. But how does that look like now in regard to our Buddhist practice? What does it mean to live life fully? And especially in a spiritual context. And then as part of this investigation, ask yourself, to what degree am I living fully? To what degree am I engaging in my life, every facet of my life, to achieve the greatest result, to have the greatest benefit for myself as well as for others? And then to accompany that thought, we generate the motivation of bodhicitta. Bodhi, the awakening state that we can achieve, citta, the mind, the heart that strives for that awakening. We strive to awaken fully ourselves so we can help others to do the same. So as we turn our minds towards this topic of the joy of living fully, we can do so with our hearts dedicated to the welfare of all beings. We're doing this investigation into this topic for ourselves so we can improve our own minds, our own lives, but with the goal of being able to have a positive effect, a beneficial effect on all beings. So hold this motivation of bodhicitta very deeply in your heart so that everything we do tonight becomes a cause for that result. Your ability to benefit all beings by becoming a Buddha, fully awakened yourself. And then open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So I think this topic, a lot of the topics I teach on every now and then, and of course I update them a little, go back to a period when I was the resident teacher for Thupten Norberling, when we were over on Alameda Street. Some of you who are from Santa Fe may remember that location. And I was invited by the SPC at that time to do a series of courses that we called the Heart of Practice. And it kind of was nice because it got me out of, I had only been teaching a few years at that point. This was like 2007, 2008. And it got me out of that kind of text-based, sort of more structured way of teaching and into some subjects that were a little looser, if you will, a little more about practice and how we engage in Buddhist practice. So there's not a lot of content to tonight in terms of things that I'm giving you to kind of think about this and what have you, but there's to look at some structure of what this means, this joy of living fully. Um, Again, as I was saying in the meditation tonight, I think all of us have come across ideas like this, sometimes in that more secular context. I remember when I first saw the film Harold and Maude. Some of you may remember that wonderful film with Bud Cort and Ruth Gordon. Ruth Gordon's this, almost 80-year-old woman in it, and Bud Cort's this younger man, and she's telling him about living life fully, and not kind of like waiting on the sidelines, but getting in there and playing the game or something. But it's all done in the context of just like an ordinary life. How do you make the most of an ordinary life? By maybe going for the gusto, engaging in life fully, getting everything that you can out of it. A similar theme, and talking about films, a similar theme was in the Dead Poets Society, right? Where Robin Williams is their teacher who's telling them, to carpe diem, seize the day, do what you can, to make use of this life in a very positive way. But it was all around, again, pretty mundane worldly concerns. So how do you take that idea, if you will, and translate it into our spiritual path so that we make sure that we are utilizing this life for the best possible result in terms of our spiritual goal? So in doing this, of course, I did do a little bit of reading, kind of poked around at some books that were out there about kind of ordinary life and making it into a spiritual path to some degree. And I want to share one quote to kind of get us started in talking about this. It's a quote from John Welwood. John Welwood is a Buddhist practitioner who's also a psychotherapist. He's written some really wonderful books. This one was an earlier book of his called Ordinary Magic: Everyday Life as Spiritual Practice. And this quote was a nice sort of beginning point for my investigation of this topic of living fully. He says, our life is unsatisfactory only because we are not living it fully, because instead we are pursuing a happiness that is always somewhere else other than where we are right now. And I like this because, again, it gets right to the heart of the matter in terms of recognizing that those other ways of looking at kind of seizing the day and what have you are really based on things that we see outside of ourselves. Kind of, oh, I'm going to go off to Paris and go see all the wonderful museums there and go do this and go do that. As if all those external things, the books that we've read and all the knowledge we might have accumulated, all those things somehow make us into something richer and something better. But, as Buddhism teaches, the goal is not to do all that external stuff to change our situation and then have the happiness or pleasure that results from that, but to find a happiness, a joy deep within ourselves that is not just more reliable, because we can have that wherever we go, regardless of whether we're at a Paris museum or whether we're just down the street at the store. Instead, we have something that we can, count upon in practice whenever we wish to have that mind. But also, it's something that gets us to a more lasting state of well-being. I want to talk by kind of defining what we mean by joy to some extent, because I kind of want to define everything we're talking about here tonight. We'll talk a little bit more, obviously, about what it means to live fully. But what is the joy that we are discussing? Now, for this one, I've added in some information that came from a later book by Matthew Ricard. Venerable Matthew is a Nyingma monk. He's said to be the happiest person on the planet based on these tests that they've done while he's been meditating on compassion. He kind of, all these readings go off the charts when they're doing brain scans of him, what have you. But he says in his book, Happiness, he says, we have seen how hard it can be to agree on a definition of happiness. This is towards the earlier part of the book where he's talking about what is happiness to begin with. And he says, we've tried to pin down the meaning of true happiness, but the word joy is equally vague, since, as the psychologist Paul Ekman has shown, it is associated with feelings that are as varied as the following. So he talks about certainly the joy we have from the pleasure of the five senses. This is something that is part of our experience as human beings, embodied with the ability to experience delicious food and wonderful music and whatever the case might be. There's amusement. We know the joy of laughing with others when something, hits our funny bone or what have you. Then we know contentment, which is a calmer kind of satisfaction, where we have the joy of just being in that moment. Maybe sometimes this happens even in nature, where we're just sort of content being in that space and not really feeling like we need anything else. There's also excitement that we have often with our joy in response to something new, something that we are kind of looking forward to engaging in. Like when I never did bungee jumping, but if you were anybody who liked to bungee jump, your first bungee jump was probably, a sense of joy and excitement at something like that. Again, was not my cup of tea, and then the last one on the screen here, relief. And that can be what happens, the joy we feel upon another emotion, kind of that diminishing in the face of fear that is suddenly, disappears because what we were afraid of, we realized wasn't really a fear that we needed to have. Anxiety, sometimes even other pleasure, but we have a sense of kind of the relief that comes. He goes on to talk about more of these that are also ways of describing joy, wonder, awe, in the face of something that really goes beyond our ability to understand it or to take it all in. The ecstasy or bliss that we might have sometimes in sensory experiences, but something that takes us outside of ourselves. So sometimes this happens in listening to an extremely beautiful passage of music or something where we just feel like we're transported to a pretty ideal place in some regard. Exultation at having accomplished a difficult task or undertaken a daring exploit. And then radiant pride, when we take pride in others, such as our children who earn a special honor or whatever the case might be. Elevation from having witnessed an act of great kindness, generosity, or compassion. Sometimes we really feel that we've got, a sense of joy that arises when we see others in their most human moments when they are responding to the suffering of another or what have you. Gratitude, the appreciation of a selfless act of which you're the beneficiary, where you feel the joy of gratitude, of being grateful for those who have benefited you. Even on the list is this last one on the screen now, which is Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude, this is a German term that means sort of taking joy in somebody else's misery. This does happen in our world. It certainly is happening with what's going on in the US, where sometimes people are taking pride and joy in something horrible having happened to somebody on the other side. This is not a positive form of joy, but it's a joy nonetheless. It has that same idea. And then at the end of this list, this is again, Paul Ekman, by the way, is this amazing researcher who's done a whole lot of work around emotions. And he, throws in these, which are more in the vein of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So all of that we talked about isn't to be excluded from the definition of joy, but we're getting closer to what we're really talking about with these descriptions that are on the screen right now. He says we might also throw in rejoicing in someone else's happiness, because this is a practice that we talk about frequently in Tibetan Buddhism in particular. One of the four immeasurable thoughts, immeasurable joy, where we think about others and their good experiences, their qualities, their happiness, and we generate a joy together with them. It's kind of a sympathetic joy. Then there's delight or enchantment, in this case described as kind of a shining kind of contentment. So we talked about satisfaction earlier, but this is a deeper form of contentment. And we might see this even in some of our teachers, right? They have this place of contentment in their hearts that we're not really looking for anything outside of themselves. Again, they've kind of gone within and found their joy within. And then the final one, which is probably the closest again to what we're talking about here, spiritual radiance, a serene joy born from deep well-being and benevolence. And this is, as he says here, which is indeed, more an enduring state of being rather than a fleeting emotion. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of this idea of the first part of the title for tonight, the joy. How do we generate a joy that is, again, something we can live with, that we can every day of our lives tap into? Because it's a place of being. It's not a place of kind of experiencing, kind of going here, going there, doing this, doing that. It's what comes naturally when we have done a lot of the work of living fully. So again, that's the context for how we're going to be talking about joy. We're not talking about, all these other forms of joy. One thing I might mention about Paul Ekman too, which I did mean to introduce him before going into that list. I've never met him, but he apparently was the inspiration for some television show. It was called Lie to Me or something like that, where this guy could tell by watching people's faces exactly what was going on, whether they were lying or not. Apparently, Paul Ekman has this skill, this ability to watch people's faces. And of course, with people who have full control over their facial muscles, certain things will change when certain emotions are registering. It's quite interesting. So the physiology of our emotions is also kind of a part of what he investigates. But anyway, the idea here is we're really trying to cultivate throughout our whole Buddhist path this deeper form of joy. When we generated our motivation of bodhicitta, we say, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit others. Well, what do we mean by Buddhahood? Buddhahood is a state where you then have the ability to help others, but your own experience is unbelievable bliss and joy, state of well-being that we've never known. We've tasted it maybe here or there through, minor experiences we've had in our own meditation or practice or what have you. But this is a transcendent state of joy, a state of well-being that we'll never be parted from. So that's the goal in Buddhism. So we can taste some of that, perhaps begin to experience some of that through this idea of living fully. So in terms of what it means, to live fully, in my own investigation into this, and I was again inspired by a few things I read, but I really see kind of, three dimensions or aspects to living life fully. And these three dimensions that I'm going to present kind of support and enhance each other. And the idea behind them is that when I talk about dimensions of experience, I'm talking about kind of beginning in the innermost level of just kind of the mechanics of our mind, if you will, moving then to a little bit more of the content of our minds, and then moving further out into how our minds in our state of positive thoughts and what have you then kind of influences our behavior, influences how we work with others. And of course, this is going to take shape in terms of anything that we do. That's the whole point of my talking about this topic tonight, is so that we can let this joy be generated in regard to whatever it is that we are doing with our lives, whether we're sitting quietly reading a book, or whether we're out having tea and coffee with others at a cafe, or whether we're, up on a mountaintop, hiking with friends or something, whatever the case might be. As well as certainly in our spiritual practice, we want to be able to bring some elements of living fully into those moments so that we're not just kind of going on autopilot. This is part of what I'm going to talk about, especially in the very beginning, kind of going, what are the kind of basic skills and abilities that we have to have in our minds in order to uh, kind of experience things in that dimension. So the very first dimension, the primary dimension, if you will, is the quality of our own state of mind, which sets the stage for how to actually reframe our thinking and act upon this foundation. So as I was saying, the first dimension is kind of the mechanics of our own state of mind that sets the stage for the thinking, the thoughts that we will introduce in the second dimension, that reframe how we're looking at things. And then in the third dimension, how we act upon that foundation. Kind of see them as all a continuum. You know, can a lot of the skills that we're going to talk about in this very first part is really, things that we generate primarily through our practice of meditation. And I know that a lot of people might feel like, okay, well, then they sit down and they do their meditation every morning and maybe every evening or whatever. But then when they get up off their cushion, there's kind of a, okay, that's over. Now I'm on to the next thing. But if we really use our meditation well, we're developing skills that we can bring into the time off the cushion, the thinking we do, the acting we do, the various places we go, what have you. If we're not bringing those skills off the cushion into our lives, well, then I'm not sure what the point is of generating them on the cushion. The time on the cushion is meant to be a support for what we are doing in our lives, meant to be fully integrated into that. I'll talk about these two things that I'm going to kind of compare. I put this together as like a comparison. The first one is the sense of presence versus distraction. Presence meaning how are we actually with every moment in a present capacity, as opposed to being distracted constantly. And of course, this happens when we're up and about and doing things, but even on the cushion, we know how frequently we get distracted, right? The mind starts wandering here and there. But distraction, of course, if it carries over into our daily life, can become really problematic. Uh, this was a few years after I'd done my initial teaching on this article. I don't remember. Yeah, it goes back to, I don't have a date on it. I printed it out in 2020 when I taught on this topic again. But it was an article from Greater Good Center in Berkeley, and the kind of a really wonderful organization that does a lot of things around not just Buddhism, but certainly, how do we work with our minds and improve the quality of our lives. He said that there was a study, at that time it was recent, by two gentlemen, Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert. They sampled over 2,000 adults during their day-to-day activities and found that 47% of the time, their minds were not focused on what they were currently doing. They weren't present. Even more striking, when people's minds were wandering, they reported being less happy. What's kind of interesting, a lot of these skills that we teach in Buddhism, especially that we generate in meditation, have a sense of well-being to them in and of themselves. When we are more present, we are actually happier beings. When we are distracted, because of course, what is it that tends to distract us? The things that distract us can be things we are kind of remembering from the past that are perhaps plaguing us or bothering us or drawing us out of the present moment at least. We might have some sort of nostalgia for wonderful things we experience that we are feeling we would rather be doing than our present moment, especially if our job is, somewhat something that is challenging for us to stay present with. But the idea is we also get distracted, of course, to the future, to a lot of, and sometimes that can have the nature of fear, it can have the nature of excitement, it can have a lot of different qualities to it. But it takes us out of being in the present moment and appreciating the present moment, which of course is in and of itself a source of joy and well-being. Again, I'm not saying every single moment of our lives that we experience is going to be capable of inducing that type of joy. We have very painful moments in our lives as well. We're going to talk about that a little bit tonight too, because we still can find some way to open to even those painful and difficult moments. But nonetheless, if we are not wanting to be present and willing to be present with what's going on in our lives, then we're missing a huge opportunity to improve the quality of our lives. All of that can make a difference in terms of how we go about as beings in this world. Because, of course, that presence is going to allow us to be more attentive to our own minds and what's going on, but also attentive to the needs of others. And that's why I put them in this kind of three-dimensional category. It's because the very first basic stuff is that you have to develop some skills, some ability to be able to use this mind well. And if we're not using this mind well, again, we're just missing the boat and really not doing the work that the Buddha is calling upon us to do. That's the essence of all Buddha's teachings, is to work with your mind. Well, if you don't have the tools, the ability to stay present with your mind, to look at your mind and see what's going on, well, then again, the Buddhist practice kind of goes out the window. So again, we can be distracted by a lot of different things in terms of the opposite of this. We can even be distracted to some degree by what it means to be spiritual. I remember Venerable Urbina, she teaches frequently kind of saying we don't need to get all holy when we're talking about being spiritual. Spirituality in Buddhism does involve this quality of presence. I think Thich Nhat Hanh in particular, amazing, Vietnamese Zen teacher that most of you know or have heard of, he had that kind of present moment, wonderful moment. There's a beauty and a wonder in being present in every moment. That in and of itself is a spiritual practice. Doesn't mean you have to look all holy or be all holy or whatever. You just have to be attentive. You have to be somewhat alert, somewhat awake. I'm going to share a little quote that will also reiterate this. Let's see what quote this is. From John Wellwood again. Again, I do like his book. By the way, one of the books he wrote is really quite nice. It's Toward a Psychology of Awakening. Can't remember the first part of the title, but it's really quite wonderful, his observations on Buddhist practice and Westerners from a therapeutic point of view. It says here, cultivating the capacity to be fully present, awake, attentive, and responsive in all the different circumstances of life is the essence of spiritual practice and realization. Because again, if we don't start with this quality of presence, well, what is happening is we have huge gaps and when we are kind of with our mind and with what's going on, right? We're with it for a moment and then we go off and we're all over the place, distracted. And then we come back to it. There's no continuity. There's no real sense of, okay, I'm going to be open to every moment and what it has to teach me, what it has to show me. So this is an important aspect of it too, is that there are so many opportunities every day that we just pass up by virtue of the mind being distracted and not being present. What's going on? What is happening? How can I respond to that more effectively? All of that comes from presence. So we're going to see, we'll feed this into the other dimensions, but this is one of the most important things to have. Now, together with presence is one of the most important skills that is a big hot topic in Buddhism and in our world, in the West at least, mindfulness. And here I contrast it with mindlessness. Another way of talking about it is mental wandering. It's a bit more like distraction to some degree. But mindfulness and presence go kind of hand in hand. If you are present, then you are being mindful of that moment. If you are mindful, then there is a presence that comes with that. The word mindfulness, let me come to that quote later. The word mindfulness itself has a couple of different meanings as it's taught in different Buddhist traditions. And as I said, it's become a huge buzzword even in secular, education and programs. I'm always amazed to see how mindfulness makes its way sometimes into school programs, often not public school programs, but nonetheless some school programs. And it's a skill that we all can have that is already there to some degree. We just haven't learned to use it so well. Mindfulness, when we look at kind of what's going on in our mind, is there pretty much all the time. We do need mindfulness to be doing all the things that we do. If you drive a car, you need mindfulness. If you're going to read a book, you need mindfulness. If you're going to make a meal, cook, you need mindfulness. Mindfulness in its very essence means not forgetting. And by that virtue of that, we talk about then being present. Because if you are mindful of what you are doing, you're not forgetting what's going on. Now, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when we would talk about mindfulness in many of his teachings, he would say, well, but mindful of what? And Venerable Rabina often points this out too, and many of you have heard her say this. Well, even a thief needs mindfulness, right? If you have somebody who is trying to be a jewel thief or an art thief, and they're going into a building that's got all those little laser beams or whatever that are going to trigger an alarm, if they need to get in through them and make sure that they're not setting off the alarm, it takes incredible mindfulness. So we're not calling mindfulness a virtue in and of itself. We're talking about it being a skill, an ability, and to know what's going on, to be able to discern what's going on because you are present with what is happening in your mind. And of course, Rinpoche would then emphasize, well, when we say mindful of what, you want to be mindful of the things we're going to talk about in the second dimension, the things that we want to bring as the content into our everyday moments. That kind of guide us, that give us the thoughts that help us to be most responsive to the world around us. So again, this is what we're talking about in terms of mindfulness, not just being this ability that we all have to some degree, but a heightened way of not forgetting, being present with what we most cherish and value in our lives. The practice that we want to bring to our every moment so that we then can further our spiritual development and be of greater benefit to others. So again, as I said, these skills that I've talked about so far, having some presence and mindfulness are really grounded in our meditation. Tonight when we started, we began with the focusing on the breath, the meditation on the breath. As most of you know, that's the first type of meditation that we are generally introduced to. It's the meditation on the breath that becomes, for many people, their practice of what we call stabilizing meditation or placement meditation. The idea behind this is that this is a main skill that we need in meditation, is the ability to place the mind with some focus, some single-pointed concentration on whatever object we're going to meditate on. And then, of course, as we get up off the cushion, to stay present with whatever it is that we are focusing on in our lives. As this is happening, someone saying something to you, whatever is going on. You want to maintain that mindfulness and not become mindless, not become, again, kind of wandering all over the place. So the very first type of meditation that we generally engage in, even in a meditation practice, people, at least those that I give instruction to, I encourage them to begin every meditation session with some stabilizing meditation. And the breath is a wonderful object to work with in regard to this, because the breath is with us all the time. We don't have to fabricate an object. Sometimes when you learn techniques for generating kind of deeper concentration, they talk about visualizing an object or whatever the case might be. Those involve some mental effort, right? You have to kind of stay, okay, I'm going to visualize this Buddha figure in the space in front of me and meditate on that. They're wonderful objects to meditate on because they're very inspiring and very kind of virtuous in nature. But nonetheless, for most of us, it's much easier to stay with the breath. I know Lama Zopa Rinpoche was not so keen on telling people to meditate on the breath, but we have to start somewhere. We have to begin to generate the skill, the ability to work with our minds through meditation. One meditation instructor may have heard of B. Alan Wallace. Alan Wallace often speaks about how Westerners in particular really benefit from working with the breath. It's said to be the antidote to a distracted mind, a mind that's all over the place. We need to come back to the breath because it's very grounding to stay with the breath, because we naturally have that inhalation, that exhalation, so we have something we can stay present with that, again, doesn't involve any type of fabrication. Now, why do you need that? Again, for the reasons we're going to talk about tonight, which are so that you can then be more attentive to your mind as you're up off the cushion and generating the thoughts you wish. But even on the cushion, you need to have a deeper concentration in order to look at the contents of that you want to kind of put in the mind, place in the mind, become more familiar with. It's interesting, most of you know this, but in the Tibetan, the word for meditation is gom. G-O-M is how it's spelled in English. Gom means essentially to become familiar with. Well, the whole process of meditation is about becoming familiar with your mind and with more positive states that you can cultivate in them. And of course, to be able to recognize the negative states, so we dismantle those and don't create them to greater degrees, and we replace them with more positive states. That's the essence of all of our Buddhist practice. So we need mindfulness as a skill to be able to know what's going on in our minds, to make those determinations. So these are some positive thoughts that I want to cultivate. So I'm going to become more familiar with them. I'm going to generate those thoughts deeper in my own mind. And that's what we're doing in the second type of meditation mainly. And that's what's called analytical meditation, which is just a fancy word for thinking. Once we've calmed the mind a bit by focusing on the breath, we then introduce something that will be a beneficial quality for us to reflect on. Either some knowledge we want to generate based on the Buddha's teachings, so we reason it through and come to know it more deeply, or a quality that we want to imbue in our own minds, such as compassion and loving kindness and so on. So mindfulness is needed for both of those types of meditation, to place the mind single-pointedly, but moreover, to keep the mind focused on whatever it is that we are trying to become more familiar with. So it's a skill that we generate in meditation, regardless of how we are meditating or what particular topics we're meditating upon. But this is an important thing, again, to recognize that that's the tool through which our mind is mainly going to be changed when it's accompanied by the concentration. When our mindfulness is there, then the mind will go deeper. We won't have so much mental wandering. We will be able to actually change our minds. And of course, the greatest change that we can accomplish is what we set our sights on in our motivation for tonight, which is the state of Buddhahood, the state of enlightenment that you can attain, that is a final result that you'll never depart from, you'll never diminish from. A state of well-being, again, that we have not known, that is so far beyond what we've ever tasted in our lives in terms of a blissful experience and an amazing open heart, towards all beings and what have you. But all of that boils down to the skills that we develop on the cushion, beginning with a stabilizing meditation where we make the mind more single-pointedly focused, and then an analytical meditation where we introduce the topics that change our minds, that cause this progress to happen. So again, when Lama Zopa Rinpoche would take some kind of issue with the way people talk about mindfulness, he was maybe like, well, what are you going to be mindful of? That's kind of that content, right? You need the skill of being present, attentive to what is happening in the moment. But then you also need, of course, to fill that space with something that is going to help you on your spiritual path. To introduce these topics. Again, things you're trying to generate in your own heart and mind, as well as understanding that you're trying to accomplish through looking at the Buddha's teachings. All of these are important. Oops, I didn't mean to skip that one. Here's a quote from John Kabat-Zinn. He's the sort of father of modern mindfulness. His book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, is a very famous book on mindfulness meditation. He says here, mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. This kind of attention nurtures greater awareness, clarity, and acceptance of present moment reality. Again, this is maybe more of like what we might call in the Buddhist tradition, the Theravadan tradition, the teachings that are really about mindfulness as this kind of unconditional acceptance of everything that is going on in every moment. As I was saying, Lama Zopa Rinpoche would maybe add a second step to our mindfulness to kind of imbue our mindfulness with something we want to be mindful of. That was his big question. He said, well, what are you being mindful of? What is it that you're being mindful of? So these two, again, can be put together. They're not totally opposing definitions. We do have to have some ability to sort of stay non-judgmentally with our minds and be aware of things. But I dare say that you could probably, once more, because a thief could be mindful doing acts of stealing, we could also be very mindful while we have thoughts of anger arising, right? Unless you are also trying to be mindful of overcoming anger through practicing and meditating on the antidotes to anger, the things that are going to diminish your anger. So again, in Buddhist practice, we're not, at least in our tradition, we're not really just kind of hanging out with this mindful quality for no reason. And I'm not saying that others do that. I'm just saying we emphasize the importance of being mindful of something, mindful of what it is that you really want to work on. As most of you know, in this Tibetan Buddhist tradition that we practice here, there are a wealth of teachings that you can analyze, many things that you can meditate on, and lots of reasonings and analyses and scriptural quotes and examples and whatever, all the various things that we can look at. And that's the richness of this tradition. It gives you an amazing wealth of stuff that you can then use your mindfulness as a tool to investigate and to change your own mind. But it all starts with those two main qualities. That's why I'm spending a little more time on those, is because they really are important. We have to be able to be present, not so distracted, and moreover, not forgetting what it is that we are trying to do. The object that we are meditating on, the practice that we are engaging in, whatever the case might be. And that carries over again into the other dimensions that we're going to talk about. I might point out, because one teacher did point this out once, said, well, there are people who in their creative process, I'm not one of those creative people. I'm such a left brain person that I don't really feel like I have much creative outlet in my life. But if you're somebody who does artwork, for example, or you write, novels or whatever the case might be, maybe having some sense of mental wandering can be useful for you as a tool to really enhance your creativity. So I don't want to make it sound like, the mind wandering or being in that kind of mode of not really being that mindful of a particular thing, that's a problem. It's a problem in terms of what we're trying to accomplish on the Buddhist path. Because if we have a mind that is distracted, it's like, we're not hitting the mark then. We're not able to kind of keep at that place where we're going to make a larger impact on our minds. So that's the idea behind it. Certainly, mental wandering, kind of the mind going out and being curious and checking out this and what have you. There's nothing wrong with it in essence, especially if we're engaged in some type of creative process, because it can be really useful for those who are creative to kind of have that ability to be inspired by whatever muses they choose to kind of come into their lives. Let's go on to the second dimension. There will be time for questions at the end. I think I'll have enough time with the material I'm going to cover to open it up to some questions. The second dimension, or secondary dimension, as I have it labeled here, is how our mind then encounters or frames what life offers us when we're grounded in presence and mindfulness. These are kind of qualities that we want to bring to our way of kind of framing things as we're going about our lives. I like this word frame, reframing. I think in Western psychology, they use this concept of reframing in a slightly different way. But in a Buddhist concept, the idea is that we have a particular perspective or paradigm. I love that word paradigm, right? It's kind of a framework around which, we see things within that box. Well, those things are self-created. Those are things that we have imposed on the world around us that cause us to see things in a particular way. So if we have some grounding in mindfulness and presence, we can begin to introduce some things that change that paradigm, that shift that paradigm a bit, so that we aren't continuing to see things in ways that are not beneficial for ourselves and others, but actually enhance how we can be more responsive to the world and also develop ourselves. So this is the idea behind these, and there's a number of these I'm going to go through. The first one I call here open-mindedness versus closed-mindedness. And I don't want to make it sound like, we're talking about kind of views about people or whatever. It's about just how do we approach living our lives? To what degree are we open to our experiences versus kind of closing and shutting down and not being fully involved and integrating, those other parts of our lives that again are not necessarily um, where we want to be. Here, the quote I want to share first, and then we'll talk about this, is from the amazing Nyingma master, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. This is a quote that Pema Chodron had in her book. I don't know the source of the original quote when he taught that, her book, The Places That Scare You. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche said, "The everyday practice is simply to develop a complete acceptance and openness to all situations and emotions, and to all people, experiencing everything totally without mental reservations and blockages, so that one never withdraws or centralizes into oneself." When I read these words for the first time, it was like, wow, that's a tall order. How do we stay open to everything that we meet? How do we have that kind of ability to not shut down, to not go within, to not close down, so that we don't take advantage of what any particular moment might have to share with us? It's kind of interesting. I don't want to go too far into the whole concept of karma, but this is very much how Pema Chodron approaches the idea of karma, is that karma is this force that manifests in what life has to teach us. Essentially, she says it's life giving us the lessons we need to learn. So if we are going to shut off certain things in our lives due to being kind of more closed-minded and not being open to whatever it is that we're going to potentially experience, we're going to potentially miss many moments of our lives that could be actually wonderful doorways for us to change our minds and learn. We do this frequently, right? It might be out on the internet, for example, and maybe you're on Facebook or some other social media thing, and you see certain things that you just go, oh, I'm not even going to look at that. Oh, I don't like that photo, or that person always posts, garbage stuff or whatever. You make all these kinds of judgments, and you don't necessarily, I'm not saying we can be open to all of those things, but occasionally kind of look at what is the mind that's causing me to close down in this moment, that's not causing me to be open to that particular situation or bit of information or whatever. And sometimes it means even being open to things that we find contrary to what we are believing in and holding to be true and what have you, to challenge that a little bit. So open-mindedness, when we talk about it here, it really is involved in curiosity to some degree. We're going to talk about curiosity next. I think that's the one I have on the slides next. But the idea is that if we start making these sorts of judgments that this doesn't warrant our being involved in it, that doesn't warrant our being involved in it, well, then we're going to once more miss out potentially on a lot of what life can teach us. Mhm. I mean, I'm trying to think of good examples for this. So sometimes when I travel, this often happens, right, where there's like something going on. And instead of staying engaged with it because you think it doesn't have anything to do with you, it's like how this person is talking to the flight attendant or whatever. You just kind of go back to your book or to whatever it is that you're doing and kind of shut off that. Well, what is it like to stay open to that? What is it like to stay open, particularly to things that are not so pleasant? We're going to see this when we look at curiosity. Can we have some willingness to stay open to those moments? To stay open to things that are maybe going to be a little more painful and difficult for us? Buddha teaches ways to work with those things too. So this enters into this idea that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, curiosity versus a sort of disinterest. We do become very conditioned in terms of what we find we are willing to take interest in. And I think in our culture right now, in America in particular, we have a lot of that kind of shutting off of things that we can't muster much interest in because we're not curious. I think I did a little class, I know I did, called Bridging Our Differences. I can't remember when this was. I think it was at the beginning of this year. And the idea there is that how do we look at ways of bridging from our own point of view to those who have views that are opposed to us? And one of the central skills that is involved in that is curiosity. Are we willing to be curious about that person, about why they hold the views that they do, about who they really are? I'm always amazed when I hear about people who've said, well, when I finally sat down with this person, I found that they were a person just like me. I mean, they had a lot of the same concerns, a lot of the same issues. Yeah, hold some views that are different, some views that might even be diametrically opposed to the views that they have. But there's some curiosity there. There's some interest in who is this person? I mean, I did just read something. I mean, I know this is on a lot of people's mind in this country, at least, is the Charlie Kirk assassination. And I was reading about how one person, I don't know if it was Bill Maher or one of these interviewers, he said when he sat down and actually interviewed Charlie Kirk, he got to know him at a very different level, right? Because again, we get these media influenced kind of things that, those then predict whether we are open to inviting that person into our sort of space of how we even think about them or investigate them. But if we're curious and we want to go beyond those sort of snapshots that are taken by other people of who those people are, we might actually find that there's something there that we might be able to connect with. But if we don't have that curiosity, and that curiosity can be about people, but it can also be about things. It can be about situations in our life, things that are going on. We get a little more curious about that rather than just shutting down and going, oh, I'll go to something that I'm more comfortable with or something that, is more in line with how I see myself or whatever the case might be. I think this is a lot of what's going on in our country is a lack of curiosity or, that becoming an obstacle. This, I think he's a Zen practitioner, Oren J. Sofer. He wrote a book. I was reading a number of parts of this. I don't think I've read it in its entirety, but it's a beautiful title. Your Heart Was Made for This. Contemplative Practices for Meeting a World in Crisis with Courage, Integrity, and Love. Huge title, but has some wonderful things in it. He has a number of these qualities in there, including curiosity. And he says, of course, beautiful and pleasing things naturally hold our attention. But can you be curious about things you dislike? Try getting interested in boredom, back pain, or headaches. He uses those kinds of things as an example, but there's a lot of things out there that we perhaps would benefit from getting curious about. True curiosity includes interest in what repels us, physical pain, conflict, psychological suffering, political difference, and unearned social or economic advantage. This type of interest nurtures empathy, insight, and skillful action. That's why we want to have a more curious approach is that, as I said, we're shutting off some avenues that could actually help enhance what we are trying to develop, right? The Buddhist path is one of empathy, of caring, of concern. I mean, we're talking about bodhicitta here, having a concern that is equal for all sentient beings. But yet we are choosing in our everyday lives to not be so curious about many of them and kind of just include them in that category. Oh, well, they're over here. There's somebody who bothers me, who's difficult for me, and I can try to work on having more compassion for them. But we're not willing to really be curious about who they are, to maybe see some other sides of them. So again, I think this is an important quality for us to bring into this sort of secondary dimension, things that will influence then how we are, as he said there at the end there, in terms of more skillful action, in terms of our interactions with other beings. Another set of qualities, one that we want to adopt and one that we want to avoid, is connectedness versus disconnectedness. You'll see that these do have some interrelation. So we started first with this idea of being open-minded, and then we look at being curious, and then a sense of being connected. As we know from the Buddha's teachings, we are all connected, whether we accept that connectedness or not and come from that place of connectedness. This is the truth of interdependence that the Buddha taught, that there essentially is nothing that stands on its own, alone, self-sufficient, totally divorced from everything else. It's just not how it works. I mean, look at the world we live in, and the complexities of it are immense. But we see that there is that interdependent connection that we have with every being. Remember when that phrase came out some years ago about 6 degrees of separation, that between one person on the planet and another person on the planet, they said there was no more than 6 degrees of separation, sometimes fewer. You find somebody who knows this person and they know somebody there and so on, you get closer and closer to them. Well, we're connected in that way, but we're also connected in so many other ways in this world. Our interdependence in terms of the food that we eat and the resources that we enjoy. being produced by people who are on the other side of the planet, right? And then we have a lot of people who, again, take an interest in doing things for us that we benefit from, producing the energy, the power that we have, what have you. I mean, this is, again, a connectedness that we need to feel in our heart, feel that every being is incredibly kind to us through that connection, contributing to our welfare in a way that doesn't allow our heart then to shut down. I know His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This was, I think, in Jeffrey Hopkins' book on something, A Truthful Heart, Generating Keenness. I can't remember the full title. Anyway, it was originally published as Cultivating Compassion. It was a wonderful book. I remember reading it and being really struck by some of Jeffrey Hopkins' stories about when he translated for the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama said once in one of his talks, he said, every person I meet, I feel like I already know them as a friend. Like there's already something there. And I'm like, oh, my old friend, and yet, these are not people that in this life he's really formally met. He just kind of came with that idea of like, this is somebody who I can already feel some closeness to. And that's this sense of connection, right? That we feel that there's something there that is bonding us to other people that is not that tangible. Again, you don't have to look at it and say, oh, well, this person did this for me and that and what have you. You don't have to have an explanation behind it. It's a feeling of closeness, of connectedness. Of course, in the Mahayana tradition, this is what we're trying to generate through a lot of our meditations, where we're looking at other beings and wanting to embrace them with loving kindness, compassion, and so on, without any exceptions. Well, it's hard to get to that, but we have to really reflect on the fact that we are in this world with everyone else and dependent upon everyone else in the way that others also depend upon us. And of course, that interdependence is what is the warp and woof of life. It's what gives everything, a deeper sense of meaning and resonance with us if we open up to that reality. And when you talk to people who are non-Buddhist about this, they kind of get it and everything. But in our Buddhist practice, this is something we really want to live from, is that sense of interdependence that we have with others. I'm going to have a little quote here from Ayakema. Ayakema is a teacher in the Theravadan tradition. And this is the quote: unless we practice loving feelings toward everyone we meet, day in and day out, we're missing out on the most joyous part of life. If we can actually open our hearts, there's no difficulty in being happy. Now, why I shared this quote is because it's speaking to what happens when we feel that connectedness. Connectedness, as I said, in Buddhist practice is a source of love and compassion. A source of being able to say, I have complete validation and justification for loving feelings towards others. Really practicing keeping my heart wide open towards others, because those others are involved in my welfare. Now, in the Mahayana tradition, again, we look at the idea that when we generate the mind of bodhicitta, every being is a support for that mind. You don't say, I want to become enlightened for all the Democrats or all the Republicans or all this or all that, all the Americans, forget about everyone else. All the human beings, forget about the animals or other beings in other realms. We say, I want to become enlightened for all beings. So again, we have to have a feeling of connection to those beings to some degree. One of the main techniques, as most of you know, for generating bodhicitta is to see all beings through the lens of them having been very intimately involved with you in one lifetime or another. And to really hold that view that that has happened, not that it's just a possibility. Every being has been your dear, kind mother. Every being has been your dear, kind father, sister, brother, grandmother, grandfather, friend, partner, child, whatever you want to use as an example. Every being has been in those roles very, very close to you and dear to you. Of course, in this life, I have one father and one mother, as we all do, right? And we have a limited number of people that are playing more intimate roles in our welfare. But every being has done that for us. So we feel this immense connection that goes beyond the time and space of this particular moment, that recognizes that all beings have been connected in this kind of dance of creation and rebirth and what have you since beginningless time. So who are we to single out and say, oh, well, they aren't worthy of my love or my compassion? Every being is worthy of that because every being has played those very intimate, dear roles for you. So this is the idea behind Ayakema's quote, is that, we have to open our heart with love and compassion for all beings. And there's a fullness that comes from that. I mean, as I go back to that title of, the joy of living fully, I think with every one of these things I'm introducing you to, if you really wholeheartedly engage in them, there is a fullness, a richness that comes from that experience and a joy that comes from that. Remember Richard Gere, who did some of the kind of comments in the Discovering Buddhism series of videos that our organization did, that the FPMT did many years ago, probably over 20 years ago now. He was talked about how when he was practicing his total transformation, what he practiced was every being that he met, he held that thought, may you be happy, as his first thought. Of course, what happens with most of us, we get caught up in anyone we meet, we start going through our own, like, kind of, you know, looking at them with some judgment and who are they and what are they about and what have you. We don't hold an immediate thought that is beneficial for ourselves and others, that is based in this loving kindness that Ayakem is speaking to. But we're essentially saying, I'm going to be concerned about the well-being of that person in front of me by wishing them to be happy as my first thought towards them. He said it was totally transformative. And it's a practice you can do, right? That is about this feeling of connection, this connectedness. This is a being that I actually am going to, acknowledge the connection I have with them by wanting them to be happy, wanting them to have happiness. Very powerful. And as I said, in the Mahayana tradition, we have a lot of teachings to support this. So I don't need to go down into, all the depths of all of that. But just know that this can also, of course, help us to break down a lot of things we have about the general way that we classify people in our lives, which is in those three categories. Categories of friends, people who are very close to us in this life, people who are strangers to us, and people who are difficult people, enemies, challenging people in this life. Those three categories are not fixed in time, right? Every being who's in any one of those categories has also been someone very dear to you, someone very kind to you. And all of them are connected in your welfare to some degree. Certainly all the strangers are. A lot of strangers are involved in producing all the food that I eat and what have you. I can't, dismiss them on the basis of not being a friend for me in this life. They've done amazing kindness. So we talk about sometimes, direct kindness, indirect kindness. Even the enemies, the difficult people, we can see as being indirectly kind because they give us opportunities to really test our patience and to really open our hearts. So again, there's lots of techniques that we've looked at in the Mahayana tradition. I don't want to spend too much of tonight going into that, but it's all based on this idea of connectedness and the amazing web of kindness that we experience on the basis of that connection to anybody who's a friend, anybody who's a stranger, anybody who's a difficult person in our lives. We're connected to all of them and can benefit certainly from all of them. Another pair that we're going to look at is this idea of kind of purposefulness. I tried to figure out a right word to put there for that, versus aimlessness. Kind of interesting when we use the word purpose. Purpose is essentially finding meaning, finding something that guides us in our lives. Now, as we know in the Mahayana tradition, what I've been talking about frequently tonight, how we started the evening in terms of our meditation, is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is this ultimate purpose that the Buddha teaches in the Mahayana scriptures is what we're all about. We're here with this purpose of wanting to help all sentient beings, wanting to make sure that what we do, all of our actions, are aimed at that, or certainly at least that they're not contrary to that. The aimlessness that this is opposed to is when we feel like we're sort of wandering without any purpose. And I'll speak to myself. Before I met Buddhism, I had left the Catholic Church when I was about 19, and I wandered around in San Francisco and, did a lot of good things, but I also was kind of just without any real compass, and where do I go? What do I do? What is my life about? What is the meaning of being here? And then when I met with these teachings, it was like, oh, that's why we're here. And it was just like a real shift because it felt like it was somewhat aimless before that. I mean, it just keep going through life, just doing whatever, enjoying all these things. And I still have many friends, kind of watch what they do in their lives. They didn't find something like this that becomes a larger purpose. And of course, I have other people in my life too, a lot of my interfaith friends that I meet with frequently. who have found another purpose that's different than the purpose I find. But having purpose in life really does redefine your life, really does change the way that you are approaching things. It becomes part of that second dimension, because then you are looking at an overguiding principle, an idea as to how you go about living your life, how you interact with people, what sorts of things you do or don't engage in, right? It becomes a very clear thing. And they have found, as I'll share a little quote from the Book of Joy about purpose in a moment. Want to start with, of course, Viktor Frankl. Many of you have heard of Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. There are a couple of other books that he wrote, but he was a survivor of Auschwitz, the concentration camp there, and is really renowned for having talked about this idea of meaning and purpose being the guiding principle that makes all the difference, especially made the difference he saw in those who were in the concentration camp in Auschwitz. So he says, being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself, be it a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter. The more one forgets oneself by giving oneself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human one is, and the more one actualizes oneself. She's talking about kind of this alchemy, if you will, of like taking on a purpose, a sense of meaning, finding something within our lives that we can devote ourselves to that really helps us to become more human than we are if we're only directed at ourselves. Of course, in our Mahayana tradition, we talk about this as part of our major shift in terms of generating bodhicitta. The other technique, I mentioned the first one that had to do with seeing all beings as being someone very close and dear to you. The other technique we use is to learn that this selfishness, this looking at ourselves and just me, myself, and I, and what do I need to just have this hedonistic pleasure in my life, that doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, it really is the cause of so much suffering for yourself and others. Whereas the mind that is cherishing others, trying to be concerned about their welfare, being driven by that purpose of benefiting other beings, is the doorway to all happiness for yourself and for others that you serve. So again, what Viktor Frankl's talking about, he wasn't Buddhist, but he's talking about the same essential principle. When we find something that is bigger than ourselves, that we can devote ourselves to, dedicate ourselves to, he used the idea of, again, something, some cause or purpose that we can align ourselves with, or even someone who we can be very dedicated to, loving and caring for them and so on. That these become avenues for us to transcend the problems of just being solely focused on ourselves. And I think we see this in our world. Again, the selfishness that is driving so many of the actions and behaviors of beings around us. And we have to be attentive to that and try to come from a place of finding our own purpose and being very dedicated to that ourselves. And in the Mahayana tradition, our purpose couldn't be clearer in terms of bodhicitta. In general, in talking about purpose, this is Douglas Abrams, who wrote the Book of Joy with the teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. In his talking about, he says, in the happiness literature, there is a great deal of research on the importance of having a sense of purpose. Purpose fundamentally is about how we're able to contribute and be generous to others, how we feel needed by and of value to others. What is our purpose for being here? How is it that we are, going to contribute to the world that, again, we're connected to? So as I said, these kind of feed into each other. When we have that sense of connectedness, it naturally drives us into some purpose that is transcending, our own needs and our own sense of what we might want and looking at how might we benefit others. Another term that I'm going to throw in here, and this is actually, believe it or not, when I think the starting points for when I first taught this back in 2007, was I read an article by Steve Pavlina, I think is his name. His name is on the next slide. He talked about living a congruent life. Congruency essentially is a lot of what we've been talking about tonight. It's like, how do I make sure that everything is kind of all lined up? It's kind of like if you have one thing that's kind of over here, another thing that's over there, and another thing that's here, they're not lined up. You're kind of all over the place. But if you line them all up, one there, one there, one there, then you've got this kind of force that happens when everything is congruent. Let me share how he approached this. The opposite to this, as I see it, is this kind of compartmentalizing our lives, where we have this over here, that over there, this in front, and they don't seem related at all. They're kind of disparate parts of something rather than being totally congruent and in alignment with each other. So he says, are we supposed to live life like a collection of parts or as an integrated whole? I wondered whether it would be possible to live in such a way where there was only one set of rules governing all areas, essentially meaning that I followed my deepest spiritual beliefs in all matters. And why I want to emphasize this one in particular is because I think it is really important that we can find a way to make sure that where we are coming from in all of our dimensions, what we are doing, is lined up, properly, is lined up with our deepest purpose and meaning in life, our spiritual beliefs that are guiding the whole show. If we think about right now in our lives, and maybe this is true for some of you, maybe others have gotten more congruent. But in general, people to think, well, here's my work life, and then here's my social life with friends, and then here's my family life, and then here's maybe my hobbies and interests and things, and maybe I have some, athletics or stuff that I do over here. So I have all these different people that I'm playing in a sense. Over here I'm on a team, and over here I'm, whatever. You get the point. I mean, if you're doing that and divvying up your life into these different compartments, well, then it feels like there's nothing really a thread holding it together. But if everything is coming from your spiritual life, everything is coming from your spiritual purpose, then it's very clear. Then I'm the same person when I'm on that team or when I'm, visiting friends at a cafe or when I'm at home with my family or whatever it might be. There's only one set of guidelines, one set of principles throughout that whole thing. And I think that is important that we have that because otherwise, once more, then we feel like it's a bit disjointed. Like, oh, well, I can sit and do my practice and be a part of a Buddhist community, but then when I'm over at work, I'm doing something that's totally opposed to what I'm learning in my Buddhist teachings. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? You're totally negating any of the effects that you're having in your spiritual practice. And I love how he identified that it's spiritual beliefs that are supposed to be the thread that runs through all of this. Those are what inform our purpose as well, for most of us. I mean, some people may feel like their purpose is to be of benefit to others in terms of being a good emergency room doctor so that everyone who comes in who's needing that assistance gets the care that they need and what have you. But there's a spiritual dimension to that as well. Maybe not everybody's dedicated to a particular spiritual path. But for those of us who feel an inclination to one, that should be the sense of congruency. That should be what guides us through whatever it is that we are doing with our lives, whatever roles we are playing, whatever hats we're wearing here and there. There's one more quote from him in regard to this that I found really quite nice. He says, "You must be true to your inner self at all times. It's the only way to be congruent and to live as a whole person instead of merely as a collection of competing parts." So the idea here is, again, what are you true to? What is it that you are in line with? And that is informed by what we said in the previous one on purpose, right? Looking at kind of how do we have a purpose that is at the root of all of it. Another thing I'm going to throw out really briefly, contentment versus discontentment. Contentment is a very powerful state of mind. And maybe I don't need to talk about it so much, but we see in our world that this kind of craving desire for more and what have you isn't really healthy. Now, on our spiritual path, we don't want to become content and not want to advance, but rather we, want to make sure that we continue to grow and develop. Nagarjuna, this great Indian Buddhist master, said, "Of all great wealth, contentment is supreme," said he who taught and guided gods and men, meaning, the Buddha. So always be content. If you know this, yet have no wealth, true riches you'll have found. So the idea is that you can be content without having any wealth, right? Because your contentment will never be stolen from you and will always be something you have. And it doesn't depend upon what you have. It's there in a state of mind that you can have with you. Positive thinking versus negative thinking. We have a lot in our culture that really reinforces and influences us to look at the negative side of things, to be very judgmental when it comes to looking at other people, to always be picking at faults, to say, oh, they're not so good, they're doing this, they're doing that. That tendency that we have to be focused on the negative even spills over, of course, into a lot of Western psychology. Western psychology is finally coming around to a bit more of the positive emotions and how to reinforce through positive psychology all the wonderful things that are sources of happiness and well-being. But they've traditionally been very much about pathology, about what is wrong, sort of negative aspects of human thinking and human behavior. Well, again, we have a choice. Are we going to focus and be more accentuating those things that are positive, that are complementary to our nature, or are we going to dwell on what is negative? I see people a lot who get very judgmental. We have a culture that reinforces being judgmental and kind of putting others down. Sometimes that comes from people not having found ways to lift themselves up. So they end up putting others down so they feel better about themselves. But regardless of where it comes from, it's not very productive. It's not something that really produces a good state of mind for us to be able to work from in our daily lives if we're constantly looking at things from that negative point of view. Rather, it should be more positive thinking. And along those lines, well, let me do one more thing here, quote, and then go on to the last one of these. People deal too much with the negative, Thich Nhat Hanh says, with what is wrong. Why not try and see positive things, to just touch those things and make them bloom? I always liked how Thich Nhat Hanh was very poetic in his writing and what have you. The last one is kind of a branch of positive thinking and negative thinking, but it's more about how are we optimistic versus pessimistic. This is also maybe one in our day and age that we can think about, because I think people are getting kind of pessimistic and looking at things and not having that view that it's going to get better necessarily, or certainly not that it's going to get better anytime soon. Matthew Ricard, going back to the book that I quoted from earlier, Happiness, he says, an optimist is somebody who considers her problems to be temporary, controllable, and linked to a specific situation. She will say, there's no reason to make a fuss about it. These things don't last. I'll figure it out. In any case, I usually do. So kind of that reinforcement of not being overwhelmed by one's problems, always looking at it in a more optimistic vein. Oh, well, I've got this challenge, I got this difficult stuff to deal with, but it's not going to be lasting forever. And, I'll find a way to work with it. The pessimist, whoops, sorry. The pessimist, on the other hand, thinks that his problems will last. It's not the sort of thing that just goes away, that they jeopardize everything they do and are out of his control. What do you expect me to do about it? It's kind of, the pessimist looks at it from the point of view like everybody's out to get me and these problems are always going to be mine and what have you. They get really kind of down on themselves. They also imagine that he has some basic inner flaw, and tells people whatever I do, it always turns out the same way, and concludes I'm just not cut out to be happy. We know pessimistic language, and we all probably have it that we tell ourselves at times. I remember Venerable Rabina, when she was teaching what she says, even if you're drowning, why not be optimistic? Even if you're like a couple of feet underwater and think you're never going to actually be able to breathe again, well, still be optimistic. Still, look on some sort of bright side that something could change there. Of course, we know one of the other principles that the Buddha taught is impermanence, that things don't last, that things are constantly changing. So that can inform this point of view. But all of these, I hope that, I've been introducing this second dimension. I've given you some idea of the sorts of thought patterns, the way of framing things that then will inform how we are in the world. For this last one, I'm not going to talk a whole lot because I don't really have a lot to say about it. It kind of follows from that. The third dimension is how we act in our body physically as we're going about doing things here and there, and our speech, which is perhaps sometimes even the more important of these two, on the basis of the mental dimensions. This includes the elements of skillful verbal and physical actions. The one way that we do connect with others most is verbally. Yes, we're physically embodied and we're with others, as we are in this teaching and what have you. But the way that we are most having an effect on others and them having an effect on us is through our speech. So if we have those other ways of framing things in the secondary dimension, and we have the root of presence and mindfulness in the first dimension, then how we behave with others, the things we say and do in their presence, will be different. Right? They will be more in line with all of that. Again, especially with that idea of congruency. You start off with kind of wanting these basic kind of openness to our own minds and being present with what's happening. And then we have certain thought patterns that we reinforce. that are positive and not going to, take us down to our normal habitual patterns. And then we actually say and do things that are very differently with others. They're different than what we have done, and they're certainly going to become the causes for our happiness and their happiness, much more so than what we were doing before. So what does this look in this way of living look like in regard to our actions? Maybe I'll take a look at just one of these. I don't know. Maybe let's do the unpleasant one. Certainly the pleasant one, such as eating a delicious meal. Well, you can think about ways of working with that. But what is the tendency when we're doing that is that we kind of shut down and becomes very narrowly focused on our pleasure and what have you. We can be more mindful as we're eating to think about the connection we have to others, to think about all the people, beings that were involved in producing that food, all the people at this time that are hungry and without food, that we can think about them, wanting them to be satisfied as we partake of that meal. There's, again, thoughts that we can introduce that are in the vein of all those secondary dimensions that I've introduced you to. The unpleasant one, such as having dental work done. Maybe this one's hard to be curious about, but I have to admit, I mean, I had one root canal done quite a few years ago. I was having really major pain in a tooth that now has been extracted. Got it extracted earlier this year, became even more problematic perhaps, but not, I don't think, from the root canal. Because again, the root canal was quite a long time ago, but everyone always says that, right? I'd rather have a root canal, as if that's like the most painful thing in the world than whatever is going on, or I don't know what they mean by it. But essentially, I was kind of curious, I was kind of, oh, what is this going to be like, and yeah, it was some pain, but it also was just kind of, oh, now I know what that is. Now I know what that's all about. I don't have to make up things about what a root canal is anymore because I've had one. But when you're having like dental work done or when you're having something that's really challenging, how can you be more open during that experience? Of course, in Mahayana Buddhism, we talk about thinking of the suffering of others. If you're having dental work done, think about the people who don't even have the ability to access dental care and are living with teeth that are infected and having problems and pain and difficulty without any relief from that, and so on. I mean, we can open our hearts and open our minds with some of those same qualities that we talked about. That feeling of connection, that feeling of curiosity, the feeling of open-mindedness, and so on. And these are the kind of qualities, again, I hope that you've gotten the way I've framed those. Are the things we bring into how we approach any of these situations. And then how we are in that becomes very different, right? Becomes a different experience. Rather than sitting and go, oh, poor me, I have to go through a root canal and all this horrible, miserable stuff about it. We just go, okay, this is understandable experience that many people have to go through. And maybe I can think a little more compassionately about others while procedure is going on or whatever the case might be. Even neutral experiences, such as driving a car. I mean, most of us, when we drive a car, we kind of go on neutral. Though the car is in drive, we're in neutral. We just do whatever is popping into our minds, or maybe we're singing along with music or something, or doing whatever. Like to do mantras when I'm driving, but generally they tend to be more neutral. When we're in the car, we don't really think so much about virtue or non-virtue. We just kind of on autopilot. But how do we introduce something that is more purposeful there? How do we see that even driving a car, we can engage in thoughts of others? We can be attentive to others and what's going on in the cars around us. Or Pema Chodron was talking in one of her teachings about other people who were stuck in traffic, just like she was. And then she began to look around at the other people who were stuck in their cars and actually saw that there was some way of connecting with them, even though they weren't sitting side by side and able to, talk to each other. Lama Zopa Rinpoche used to talk about how we use while we're driving, and certainly when things appear to us, as a reminder of karma, of, various things, causes and conditions that come into play. So if you go to work and you have this wonderful, smooth experience and everybody kind of just naturally gets out of your way and you get to your destination even earlier or what have you, well, then you can go, oh, wow, that's an interesting karmic experience. Or you get on the traffic and yeah, it's all backed up, or people are being really belligerent and difficult and, driving in front of you, cutting in front of you, what have you. Then you kind of think about the karma of that. And you just sort of accept it rather than getting bent out of shape by it, which is the tendency we have, right? So again, I say here neutral experiences, but driving also can have whatever experiences. Anyway, these are just some examples Obviously, in terms of our spiritual practice and the other things that we're doing, we want to bring those ideas into them even more wholeheartedly. Lama Zopa Rinpoche has an amazing little collection of advice he gives about how to bring bodhicitta into your everyday life. So once more, just to really quickly recap, I won't talk much about the third dimension here, but we have the primary dimension, which is presence and mindfulness. The secondary, which includes open-mindedness, connectedness, purposefulness, congruency, contentment, positive thinking, and optimism. Again, going back to this idea of, I think this is how we live more fully. If we have these dimensions to our life, then how we are in the world and the things that we are doing are coming from that place. And without those skills, we're going to, again, not be taking full advantage of this life. Not in, again, that carpe diem movie type of way where it's like all about, going for the gusto and getting all these wonderful things out of life. It's back in the traditional Buddhist way of making the best use of this life. Because this life, understanding the concept of rebirth, is like one part of a relay race. The baton is handed to us at the beginning of this life, and we run with it until we hand the baton off to the next life. So we have to be somewhat conscious that that is the overall goal is we want to make sure we use this life well. We live this life fully and have a joy that comes from that that will be more lasting, more beneficial. I didn't give much time for questions, I'm sorry, but we can take a couple. Are there questions from anyone online or in the Gampa? No, everyone got it? Everyone's going to immediately practice it. No, I'm just joking. Obviously, all of these things take time. One of the most beneficial teachings is the one Venerable Rabina is constantly reminding us of that Lama Yeshe used to say, slowly, slowly. You have to just kind of be gentle and understand that it takes time to change our minds to do these things. Any final, again, questions, comments even? Welcome to make a comment. It doesn't have to be a question. Nothing. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that what I provided you with tonight is some structure, some ability to approach life in this idea. Again, this doesn't come from a Buddhist sutra. There's not like the sutra of the three dimensions, or something like that. This is just an observation I had and kind of when I was picking this apart way back in 2007 and saying, well, what structure do I give to this? But it is kind of interesting to think about our lives that way. It starts again with some very basic foundational stuff that Buddhism teaches, then things that are informed by Buddhist practice that give us a different way of approaching our thoughts and how we are in the world. And then that actual dimension of our thoughts and our behaviors, actions, physical and verbal actions as we interact with others. Let's do our dedication prayers. As usual, we're going to do the one that dedicates for the goal that we had in mind in regard to, was there something in the chat box? Oh, yes. Oh, just some applause from Amata. Thank you, Amata. So let's do the dedication prayer that's in line with our motivation of bodhicitta that we generated at the beginning of tonight. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then this wonderful prayer for bodhicitta to grow and develop, this amazing wish to benefit others. May it generate in our hearts very deeply and strongly, but also in the hearts of all beings, especially those in our world who would benefit greatly from having bodhicitta, those who are going contrary to that in their actions. We want them to find this deepest purpose in life and to benefit from that. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then keeping in mind that we need spiritual guides on our path, we're going to focus here on His Holiness, but also any other teachers that we have in Buddhist traditions as well as other traditions. We want them to continue to be in this world and to have their wishes fulfilled. So we're going to bring those thoughts to mind as we recite this prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then, as I think all of you know, our spiritual director, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who founded this organization back with Lama Yeshe many, many years ago, passed away about a little over 2 years ago now, and apparently his reincarnation has happened, but they have not yet located that reincarnation, so we can once more benefit from his guidance and presence in this world in whatever form Lama Zopa is now appearing. So we're making prayers for that to be auspicious, for everything to happen well for that. Not just so we can benefit, obviously, but so that all beings can benefit by the return of this amazing being into our world. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wear the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Prayer written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama for us to recite. So I have strong intentions around that as well. Lastly, just, I always like to close with us thinking about other beings, and especially those that are in our lives quite directly that we know who are experiencing suffering or difficulty, obstacles, illness, whatever is going on for them, even those that we know who have died recently. We think about them and we send this positive energy out to them. So it becomes a cause to immediately remove all of their suffering and to create the causes for them to have true happiness. And may all beings have this same result through what we have done here tonight. Really think strongly that what we've done is benefiting all beings, regardless of how they are in our lives right now. We want them all to accrue benefit from what we have done. Okay, thank you all for tuning in tonight. Although those online, really appreciate you being here, and those in the Gompa. So I will look forward to seeing you all again at some point. I don't know that I'm back for a while. November, I think, is when I'm back again. I'll be doing a tour of Spain, a couple of centers in Spain in October, but you'll see me back in November at some point. So, all right. Thank you again for inviting me to be here with all of you and for joining me this evening. Be well. Thanks.